Hit it. It's Friday, August 26, 2022, episode 193. I'm Patrick Ceresna.
And I'm Kevin Muir. This week, it's an interview-only show where we have the pleasure to be joined by Mary Childs, author of The Bond King, How One Man Made a Market, Built an Empire, and Lost It All. We have a fascinating discussion about her book with a special emphasis on the trading aspects of Bill Gross and PIMCO's rise to the top of the bond world.
Well, I'm sure everyone will be disappointed that there will be no stupid questions or skin in the game this week. But folks, just as a reminder, there is no episode next week. We'll be back to our normal format on September 9th. Otherwise, have a great Labor Day, everyone. And let's get to our interview with Mary.
It's our pleasure to welcome to the show Mary Childs, the co-host of Planet Money, former Bloomberg reporter, and author of the new book, The Bond King, How One Man Made a Market, Built an Empire, and Lost It. Mary, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I just loved your book, and I'm going to just jump right into it because there's one part especially that I feel was, it was like a breath of fresh air. It's been bugging me forever. And let me tell you about it. It's when I've heard whisperings of the famed Ginny Mae futures trade, which bankrupted many Chicago pit locals and crushed a few banks. And so I've heard this, in fact, like Dennis Gartman, I think, the famed newsletter writer, he talks about this one. He got run over by PIMCO. He talks about it being his worst trade ever, if I think I got it right. And I've never had anyone, just put it out there and explain it to me. And your book does a marvelous job at going through it. And I would just love to hear, how did you unearth it? And maybe you could give us a little synopsis of the trade, because it was just so fantastic.
I love that you zeroed in on that because that's my very favorite trade in the book. It was gnarly to report. It was gnarly to understand, but it was the payoff for me was just like so great because it is really spectacular and it really did help to establish PIMCO's reputation on the street. And that's basically how I came across it. I went to a luncheon with a source and he happened to be, it was this, investing luncheon, like the kind, a symposium type of thing. You go listen to an expert, and he just randomly invited me and happened to be with a friend who had been at one of the banks in the 80s. And this guy who was, an old timer, he was like, "Oh, you're writing a book about PIMCO? Get the big fish, get the Ginny Mae CDR trade in 1983. And so I had this, it's so helpful because it's just like an index card that everything sorts itself under. And it's just like, it became a mission for me where he's like, you need to know this story. This story is, and the way he, every once in a while you come across a source that just impresses, like they transfer their enthusiasm or their passion or their viewpoint onto you. And this was one of those it was such a brief interaction, but this was one of those moments where I was like, this guy who I met for, a few hours, the only thing he needed to impart to me was getting this trade. And so I was like, yes, sir, I shall get that trade. And it was so hard. Like all these,
because it's been a long time. Like that's,
ages,
83 and not only that, the product doesn't even exist anymore. So it's can you tell people kind of what the trade entailed and what PIMCO did that was so unusual and how they figured it out?
Yeah. So this is going to be kind of the broad brush version, but essentially this contract was, very new. We were still figuring out how, these futures contracts would work, not just with Ginny Mae's, but we were kind of just exploring that world writ large and writing new things and trying to make them attractive to buyers and sellers, right? Trying to make a market so that it had rewards for, the product needed to be compelling to both sides. And as such, there were a bunch of different levers in this contract, in this CDR contract. And it was pretty popular when PIMCO stumbled upon it. And the thing that hadn't really been examined, there were like too many levers in this product. Basically, the various ways that you could interact with the product, there were just too many different things. And the interest rate paradigm was such that rates hadn't been going down. And because of negative convexity in mortgage-backed securities, you have this funny phenomenon where, the higher interest rate coupon securities are worth less because, people pay off their mortgages, they buy a new house, they try to avoid those higher rate, agreements. And so essentially what happened was rates had just begun to turn. And as a result, the market hadn't really understood the ways in which these various levers in the contracts interacted or acted under a different interest rate paradigm. So, the number of cheapest to deliver Ginny Mae's, those higher rate bundles, they were becoming, they were suddenly finite in a way that I think people just hadn't anticipated. People thought that supply was going to continue, and it just wasn't. So PIMCO figured this out. And I'm kind of explaining like one leg. They basically decided that if they were to force physical settlement,
Right.
people kind of forgot that that was an option in general. People kind of always forget that this is an option, I think. Like there are a number of times in PIMCO's history where they're like, by the way, physical settlement, and everyone's like, like, oh no, I didn't plan for this. So the really glorious moment to me is when they're going around in Chicago and demanding this physical settlement, demanding the cheapest to deliver Ginny Mae's, which at the time, there was a finite supply and people were kind of caught off sides, like, oh, we don't have enough. And so we're going to give you the more expensive to deliver. So that, I think, there's a second part of it where it becomes this perpetual. And that's a whole nother, it's kind of a two-pronged trade. And I think Gartman, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was the first leg. I think he was the cheapest to deliver leg. But it's just so legendary. If you come across the right person, in the futures market in Chicago, they're like, yeah, no, that was brutal.
Well, and I guess the way that I would think about it is that everyone was pricing it off of this cheapest to deliver, but PIMCO bought so many that they took all those cheapest to deliver, and therefore people they were pricing it off that one, but not enough of them existed.
Exactly. Thank you for closing that loop. Yes, I failed to.
Yeah, no problem.
Exactly. It was basically, did they mean to corner the market? I can't say that I knew their own mind, but was that the effect? And did that make the trade work? Yeah. That was.
And not only that, the guts that they had in that they were $2 billion of assets under management. They were still pretty small at the time. And yet they had $2 billion of this notional futures contract.
Exactly.
Which was just, not that many people were using it. It wasn't something that most mutual fund companies were able to do. And they had to go around and convince everyone.
Exactly.
So when you're thinking about the history of PIMCO, which you found, do you think that was the trade that cemented them and really put them on their way to being the kind of the biggest fixed income house in the world?
I think so, honestly, because it was such a complicated trade. It caught so many people so off guard. As you say, it wasn't like the most on the run thing in the world. Like not everyone traded this contract, but it was, there was liquidity. It was a real product that people were involved in. And so the people that were involved in the mortgage market, in the futures market, it touched this like area that I think, the overlap of those markets, that kind of demonstrating that kind of expertise, flexing right there, really helped to establish PIMCO's reputation in these kind of, they're the furthest on the spectrum, I feel like, of complexity and of kind of this, people in those areas kind of pride themselves on that complexity, on doing the work, on doing the homework and understanding all the different assumptions and levers. And, if your model's better than the next guy, then you'll outperform. But the fact that PIMCO so early on in these markets was able to just like throw down like that, I think just it established very firmly this reputation that they're going to just rip your face off. And you have to be ready for that. You're not going to know. Like you need to be aware when you're trading with these people that they are brilliant. And obviously that reputation is self-perpetuating. That reputation is so helpful. And there's a way in which, PIMCO always acted like they were going to become this, powerhouse, this, absolutely foundational, enormous asset manager, but they weren't always, right? They had the swagger before they really were that. And I think that this helped to further the legend. And, in fixed income, that reputation is super helpful because you end up getting better execution. You end up getting those new issue allocations that maybe you wouldn't have if people were like, oh, who is that? Whatever, ignore them. Being established in this way, I think was super helpful for their brand. And that ended up being very helpful to their business.
Now, I'm a former equity derivatives trader. And so I never dealt with PIMCO, very rarely. But, the difficulty in dealing with them was legendary. And I still see in my groups that sometimes the fixed income fellows and gals are nice enough to let me join their groups, and I'm there and I still see them complaining about them. And I guess what I didn't understand, having never dealt with them, from your book was you gave just a great kind of explanation and you colored the kind of the atmosphere there. And I'm just going to quote something from you here because I thought it was really well written and just really just a great example of what PIMCO was like. And you said, and those weird, intense, paranoid men and the odd woman seem to thrive in direct inverse proportion to the depth of their emotional problems. New hire interviews should be 2 questions. Were you abused as a child, and did you like it? It was like kids pulling wings off of a fly because they all arrived missing wings themselves. And I love that because it showed that they really were a bunch of, I don't know, not misfits, but maybe you could tell me your impressions of the kind of atmosphere that existed in PIMCO.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't for me. Like, I feel like I'm glad I did not work there. I've enjoyed talking to the people I talked to, but yeah, that intensity was real. Like, it's funny, even as I heard so consistently from so many people about that corrosive environment, it still is shocking, right? Like, I talked to someone after the book came out who told me a story about applying to work as like an assistant, a trade assistant on the trade floor, as like a temp, I think. And the hiring agency legitimately asked, like straight out, being like, so, tempers can run pretty hot on the trade floor. How do you feel about abuse? Emotional and verbal. And I mean, I knew like that's in my book, but the fact that someone literally asked that out loud, I was still like, oh my God, like that is just next level, right? So it continues to surprise me, even though I know and like lived in it to some extent by talking to all these like pretty traumatized people. I don't know that they would characterize themselves as traumatized. In fact, I got an email from someone who had worked in PIMCO, and he was like, I don't think it was that bad. We weren't bullies. Like, it was great. It was a family. We loved each other. And then his email goes on, it's pretty long, and he's talking about the environment and all they did. And he's like, people came in from Goldman and Morgan Stanley, and we chewed them up and spat them out. And I was like, babe, I think we're saying the same thing. Like, you and I agree. You just liked it. Like, that's our fundamental difference here. So, it is a matter of perception, and it is definitely through the lens of like, I'm glad I wasn't there, but it was this very intense. And they thought that, this worked because you have to be sharp in trading. You have to be sharp in the market. You have to find ways to outsmart the next guy. And this isn't a warm and fuzzy place, because like that doesn't help us do better at getting better execution for our clients. The tougher we are, the better we do, is kind of the sense that I got.
One of the things stories that I loved is the trader at PIMCO that felt bad about reaming out his sales traders that he had to deal with on the other side. Yeah. And he set up a mock kind of like Scream Fest. Can you tell us that story just briefly?
Yes. So basically there are all these phone lines that are more or less open. So if I picked up the phone next to, my colleague, I can hear his conversation. It's just an open line. And this guy figured out that basically he could put on a show and establish kind of firmly this reputation of being, aggressive and mean and like being so hard on the street, which is cool at PIMCO, but actually not long-term necessarily cool for your career. And also maybe not cool for your personality. Like, worth noting that a lot of people are nice people. And when they get in there, when they're on the field, they're like, oh God, I have to do this thing. I have to be cruel to these people who I know are people, and who like in any other job I would be having dinner with, and like, going to see like doing stuff that's enjoyable and like, fraternizing with them. And in this job at PIMCO, I don't really do those things. They're more or less viewed as the enemy, taking basis points that otherwise would go to our clients. So this guy figured out that he had a good enough relationship with a couple of his sales coverage, and he would message them and be like, it's on. And that was code, right? The recipient would say, okay. And this guy would call the sales coverage and be like, you need to give me better execution. Like, just chew them out. Just give this huge performance, this speech. I can't repeat the things that he would have said because it would be too many bleeps. And the sales coverage would be like, I get it. I hear you. I'm sorry. I'll do better next time. I'm sorry. I'll do better. And then they would hang up, and everyone on the trade floor would be like, yeah, man, like that was sick. That was all, like he would have firmly established his reputation. Again, very important to do, as being this hard ass. Can I say that on your podcast?
Yeah, no, you can say whatever you
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got dinged for having a potty mouth, so I'm sorry about that. But no harm done to the actual relationships that he had to maintain with the street, which are, as we know, very important. But within PIMCO, he would just like kind of ring the bell of his reputation and then come revisit that whenever he felt it was necessary to put on another performance.
I was shocked at one point, Bill Gross, you quote him as, I think it was Bill Gross, or it might have been his second in command there. He says, the street is making too much money, which means you guys are not doing your job. We need to pound the lights out. You need to squeeze for more basis points. And then traders looking at each other saying, don't we do that already? It really was like the fact that Bill Gross was upset because the Wall Street was making money. He thought that he was personally had to pull it away from them.
It is this defensive stance, right? Of any time someone is making money off of you, that's money that should go to your clients. That's something that you need to defend, tooth and nail. That's your job. And I think one part that I loved about this was when you think about the Treasury future thing, they had another kind of low-key cornering a market and in Treasury futures this time in the like mid-aughts. And it was an interesting problem because when you see a trade like that, I feel like I understand the mentality a bit where you're like, okay, if I do this thing, I can make a lot of money for my clients and, it follows myself. And that's good. If it's a little bit at the cost of, people liking me on the street, like why is that an impediment?
Yeah.
Why is that an obstacle to me doing this trade? I should absolutely just do the trade. Whereas a lot of other people at other shops see that reputational risk and also regulatory risk and say like there's a lot of like invisible cost here or difficult to price cost here. And I think, the trader at PIMCO who was sort of show ran this trade, those were not relevant to him. That wasn't his job. So he had a narrow lane, perceived this narrow lane, I think, and acted accordingly, right? Like everyone else gets to worry about the the regulations and the reputation and all that other stuff. My job is basis points and getting them from other people.
When I was shocked about learning about PIMCO and its history was, although it was kind of a traditional money management shop and not like a hedge fund that's dealing with insane leverage and everything, they were really just as ruthless as the Steve Cohens and all of that. And then you brought up a point there where you talk about, well, they shouldn't feel bad if they're running over some other hedge fund or if they're close to the line. They're doing this for the clients. And one of the things that you write here is you say PIMCO's willingness to dance on the edge, its dedication to it would show up again and again over the years in its investing. Eternal paranoia about falling behind led to a love of risk-taking. Inside its walls, the mood was the same. A pressure cooker kept right below the boiling point. A delicate tension with careful candy management could continue to bear that outperformance. So one of the things that I was shocked at, though, is when I started to hear some of how close they came to those edges and that line. It was just like, oh no, like that's almost wrong. And for example, the odd lots story, which I knew
I knew you were going to do that.
Why did you tell people just briefly about the odd lots story? And it was actually riskier than they realized. And I'll just let you tell it, and then I'll explain why I think that they took a big gamble with that.
Yeah. So basically, the fundamental mechanism of the odd lot thing, what we're talking about here is PIMCO had this new ETF and they really wanted it to succeed. And, the ETF was going to start small, starting from zero, it's brand new. And it was supposed to mimic the flagship PIMCO Total Return, enormous behemoth mutual fund, right? And the idea, there's a chat, and let me actually pull it up so that I do it correctly because Lord knows I don't want to misquote here. But there was this fluke in the market. There was this weird little mechanism wherein if you, especially in the mortgage market where you have these pools of mortgages and you can buy and sell them, over time, those pools kind of decay in a weird way where people, move, they pay off that loan and get a new one. So the old loan in that old bundle just evaporates. It goes away. And as a result, that happens a lot over time in these pools, and the pools become kind of like misshapen and like they have holes in them. It's just like they're not the like beautiful round lot thing that they were when they were first born. And these odd lots are like, you have to do more research on them. They're just a little bit more annoying and trade at a discount as a result. So PIMCO sees this and at some point realizes that if you plop an odd lot into the pricing system, it just rounds it up to a round lot. There's no real reflection in the pricing mechanism that they use in the pricing systems to account for that discount that those odd lots trade at. So that means if you buy an odd lot for, I don't know, 65 dollars and you put it in the system, it just gets valued at, say, 82. And that's just, you didn't do anything. You just bought the odd lot and the pricing system said, oh, look, a beautiful round lot, and rounded it up. And so that's like just beautiful, immediate paper gain, right? Like that looks great. And it looks like, it appears as though the SEC seems to have found that PIMCO did this on purpose, did this, exploited this fluke in order to juice performance out of the gate, close quote, in that new ETF. So basically, saying there's this handwritten note that Bill Gross sent to the trade floor saying, today, ASAP, within the next 2 hours, find 1 to 2 million bonds in your area that are 2 points or more cheap to how they would be marked by pricing services at close tonight. So, you kind of do get to the intention there. But it's funny when this came out. I'm excited to hear your point on this, because when this came out, I distinctly remember other folks in the area being like, wait, we're held accountable for this like random fluke in how the pricing system works. Like, I buy odd lots. I put them in the pricing. Am I going to be in trouble because my pricing system's messed up? Like, or like just makes this like little dumb assumption and like, isn't that nuanced? Like, what am I supposed to do? So I thought that was, obviously the difference is intentionality, right? And like this as a strategy. But okay, go. What's your thing?
But if their ETF had contracted instead of expanded, they would have been forced to sell, and therefore the price that they would have, when they went to sell it, they would be back to selling it at 62, maybe even lower, because let's face it, the only reason it was 62 was because they bought it, and they would all of a sudden have a pricing that wasn't correct. So I don't know. Listen, I don't know who's to blame. I do know that if their ETF had contracted instead of expanded, they would have been the discrepancy would have been found out quicker.
I think that's probably true. But I will note, though, I think it does depend on the timing, right? Because if they'd done that immediately, yes. If you buy it for 65, it's marked up to 82, and then you have to sell it right away, you're going to get 65. That's the market. You just found that out. Like, that's what pricing system, that's price discovery. We all know that. However, PIMCO didn't sell these, exact odd lots for a while. And apparently they were able to sell them at basically near the reported values, like the values that they had written down. So, that's a rising market. So it's a bit of I'm muddying the question a bit, but, but yeah.
No. So, but I guess I was just surprised, because to me, they were always so, I don't know. They just seemed boring. It was always like this fixed income, and I get it. As an equity guy, we find most hedge funds most fixed income boring, and everyone focuses on these hedge funds. But in every way, this was it was a cutthroat, very aggressive shop that, in essence, was no different than the most aggressive hedge fund, except that they didn't use leverage.
Well, I will push back on your assertion that they didn't use leverage, because I feel like PIMCO in particular was sort of the like closet, like side door, just to mix metaphors, leverage play. Like, if you wanted a mutual fund that doesn't quote use leverage, close quote, but also very much does, except embedded in, the idea of like lambda cash and, leaning on cash equivalents, like all of these tenets of what Bill Gross called structural alpha. Some of the tenets are very much leaning on leverage that's more or less like, it's like woven into the language of the contracts that they're trading. It's not like I am trading on margin. It's not borrowing money. It's different in kind, but it is still leverage. So,
why do you explain, if you could, that cash equivalent arbitrage that he found out? Because I thought that was another interesting one.
I love this one because it's pretty, like, you can wrap your head around it and you're like, oh, like, it just makes great sense. So basically, if there's if you're trading a contract or a product that requires that you hold cash against it, that's fine. Okay, great. Hold cash, collateralize your thing. But it's often called cash and cash equivalents. That's what you're supposed to hold, cash and cash. And like, what's a cash equivalent? There's a lot of subjectivity there. You can actually get a little creative. So most shops, especially conservative ones, like mutual funds that are thinking of themselves as risk averse, as safe, as steady, as boring fixed income, might say, okay, like, let's hew pretty close to cash and, stick this money in, something very, very safe and stable that's very fungible, that we can, convert 100 cents back to 100 cents. PIMCO is like, okay, I want to get a little yield here. Like, why would I waste my time just, why would I focus on something so conservative that's only going to be, 100 cents for 100 cents when I could go buy a short dated floating rate corporate note that's going to yield a little bit more. Maybe not a lot more, but over time, those you're just raking in these little pieces of basis points here and there, and that can really add up. And this isn't, a crazy thing to do. This isn't a really reckless, risky thing to do, I think, because it's, you're going to probably be fine buying short dated Campbell soup, right? It does get a little bit more subjective the further out the risks, suddenly you're talking about Russian floaters. Does that count? I don't know. Reasonable people can disagree at different points in time. So I think it's you do see that spectrum. It kind of thinking about this kind of unfolds that risk spectrum and says, okay, most people are going to stay pretty close to the starting point. PIMCO's going to feel it out, keep going.
Right. And you touched upon one of the things that the other surprise for me in your book was their reliance on having the best systems. And I want to touch upon one person in particular. And when I heard the story of her and she kept coming up in your book, I thought a little bit about Marcia Lucas, the wife of George Lucas. I don't know if you know this, but Star Wars, when George originally made the film, it was just the plot was a garbled mess. It was terrible. Literally, it was terrible. And she came and she, behind the scenes, rewrote the whole thing, made it the classic tale that it is. And she actually eventually won an Oscar, I believe, for screenwriting from this. And I always think that
she got really, credit.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
That actually is amazing. But I feel like this Pat Fisher, when I hear about all the things that she did behind the scenes, I'm like, oh, this woman is the Marcia Lucas of PIMCO. She deserves way more credit for establishing it as the dynamo that it is. And I would just love to hear, do you feel the same way? Were you surprised when you learned about her?
I was, actually, because every time she came up in a story, it was in a different way, because she did so many different jobs that, this confused me for a while, where I was like, wait, I thought she was in charge of HR. Wait, I thought she was in charge of the back office. Wait, she ran the cash desk. There were so many different things. She wore every hat. If there was a hat, she wore it. She organized the move to the new office. She designed it. She got the furniture. She installed, created and installed pneumatic tubes. Do you remember at the bank, you used to put a check in a little VHS plastic box and then put it in a magical tube and it would zoop its way over across to the teller? Pat Fisher put that in the PIMCO office to reduce the errors in trade tickets so that you wouldn't have someone racing between the trade floor and the back office, physically, and things don't get lost and communicate. It would just be simple. It would just zoop over. And I just that's amazing. But she shows up in so many different ways, and I think was so crucial and critical to the firm's infrastructure and business building. But yeah, it was invisible. No one gave her any credit. And I feel like this is just so not shocking given what we know about our society and
yes.
the things that I'm not surprised by it, but it's just so disappointing because it's just so on the nose. She was never even made partner.
Yeah.
I call her, in my head, she's a co-founder. This woman created, congratulations on having a good track record, but you can't have a good track record if you can't if your banks don't trust you to execute cleanly. You're not going to continue to thrive as a business if your counterparties think that you're kind of shoddy at doing, if you drop the ball all the time. So I think it's disappointing.
It's disappointing, and it's great that you're telling her story, though. Because honestly, that is exactly what I got out of it, is this woman should have been a founder, because that's how important she was to the business. And I do understand that you can't just be trading without someone doing the settlement, doing those things, because otherwise it just falls apart. Okay, exactly. So we haven't talked a lot about Bill Gross, because I feel like he's gotten he gets too much attention now, and I really love the parts of your book that were kind of less Bill Gross. But let's talk a little bit about him.
Sure. Sometimes this book is categorized as a biography. I'm like, it's not.
Yeah, no, I must admit, that's what I thought it was, and it ended up being more of a history of PIMCO, and that's just my impressions. But so one of the things is, could you first of all, I as a Canadian, and I actually grew up in Winnipeg, where Bill Gross's parents are. We're not all cold.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. I do sort of slander all Canadians. I apologize.
It's not you. It's Bill Gross has like a mother edifice problem or whatever it is. They like he just what. So why don't you talk about first of all his issues with his mother? Because I thought it was interesting because it comes in time and time again.
Yes, absolutely. Mother Goose Shirley. He definitely had this weird dynamic with her where she was always pressing him to do better, to be a better dancer, to just get a job, to do, be better. And I think he really internalized that. And he had this unending drive, this relentless drive to be extraordinary. And, this shows up time and again throughout his history where he, runs a ridiculous amount, like a painful sounding amount. He goes to Vegas and, focuses for 3 months straight to count cards. Like that's intense. Just really had this need to be extraordinary. And part of that was in large part, that was in service of becoming famous. He always said from the get-go that he wanted to be famous. And I think, we've talked about this somewhat at length, and I think he told me that it was because of these cold Canadian parents. I'm so sorry.
It's all right. It's no problem.
I thought it was. Think about
I got a good laugh.
This,
I got a good laugh about it.
Yeah, you're like we are cold, but we have sweaters. Like it's okay. Yeah. Yeah, that basically he wanted fame to like fill in this hole in his heart, to be a proxy for love. And he says, rationally, I know that's not going to work. I know that's not at all like mathematically the answer, but nonetheless, he would wake up every morning and need to be famous again. So I think, that is why you see so many famous Canadians. Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, okay.
At least she didn't mention like
Morissette,
Justin Bieber,
or
although Drake,
that guy from the band. Yeah.
That guy.
My husband would be so embarrassed that I did not. Is it Levon? No, who is it? Come on, help me out.
The guy from the
I'm
band.
Googling it right now.
Lena's saying Celine Dion. You're missing
Celine Dion. Okay.
Yeah, just so many. Brian Adams, you're missing. Anyway, so let's go back and talk about Bill Gross. One of the things I was shocked about, you've touched briefly on this about his card counting days. I didn't realize how important the card counting and then Ed Thorpe was in the history of Bill Gross.
Ed Thorpe is a huge part of the formation of Bill Gross. It's pretty incredible. First, I do want to say that Levon Helm is the only American in the band, so everyone else is Canadian. I apologize for the error. But yeah, so Ed Thorpe published these books, Beat the Dealer and then Beat the Market. And he's published others. But in Beat the Dealer, he kind of prescribes the strategy of how to count cards. And Bill Gross had been on spring break and had lost money gambling that he didn't have to lose. And he was just kind of perusing a bookstore and saw it and bought it. And this book. And then he happened to be in a terrible car accident his senior year of college and ended up in the hospital for many months and was bored, just so bored, sitting in this hospital bed forever, missing class, just unable to really do much. And he picks up the book and starts reading it. And he's like, this can't be true. Like, this is too good to be true, that you actually can come up with a system to beat the dealer, that you can count cards, keep track of a score in your mind that gives you kind of an edge, that gives you an advantage over the odds of the deck. And he practiced to find out if it truly worked. And he practiced and he practiced and he found that it did work. So he was like, all right, fine, that's great. I'm going to really try this out. I'm going to take it to Vegas. And he went for 3 months and, ended up turning a little pile of money, $200, into 10 grand. And the legend goes that he that put him through business school. Now, some of that original capital, I think, actually was his friends. So I'm not sure how he parceled that out. And I think he also got assistance from his wife at the time. But all that aside, the legend is 200 to 10 grand. Which later then he was like, that's a terrible ROI for the time that I put in.
But then he goes to Vietnam and he comes back in another Ed Thorpe book.
That's
and
right.
Ends up changing his life.
That's right. So that's Beat the Market. And basically he did the same thing. He read about, Ed Thorpe's discoveries and strategies and was like, this is amazing. I love it. It's the same as card counting, that I can come up with this system or lean on this system and take it to another casino, if you will, which is financial markets. And this was about converts. And so the kind of maturity of his understanding, he went into his job interview at Pac Mutual, having written his thesis in business school on converts. And they were like, well, that's cool. And that basically got him the job.
Now, obviously, you've gotten to chat with him a lot. First of all, could you tell us the story of that you opened the book with?
Oh, no.
Of how you met him the first time? Because it just, I must admit, I felt for you. Like,
oh,
really...
Thank you. I'm glad that transmits. It was painful. Yeah. Some people have been like, wow, you really opened your book with an embarrassing story.
Oh, no, it's a great way then. It's a great opener.
Well, we're all fallible, like I want to make the point. So the story goes, and it's 100% true. I lived it. I'm telling you. It was 2013. I had this great scoop on, a trade in the market that I covered, credit default swaps. And it was about, PIMCO doing this enormous thing. And I was so proud of myself. I loved my scoop. I loved getting scoops. And I had a billion sources on it. And I did my little story. I wrote it all. I fact checked and I made sure it was all perfect. And we queued it up to be published, and I go home. And the next day, my story's out. I'm so proud of myself. And I get this message from my colleague, Cordell Eddings. And he's like, hey, Mary, it sounds really stressed out. And, when you publish a scoop, you're kind of preening a little, you're peacocking around. You're like, or I am. And I'm like, I did good. Look at me.
And you're at Bloomberg, just to let everyone know, you're at Bloomberg.
Yeah, I'm at Bloomberg
time.
News at this time. I'm I don't remember how old I was. I'm in my 20s. This is my bread and butter at the time. I'm very pleased with myself. And so Cordell's like, Mary, Bill Gross is on the radio and he just name checked you. And I'm like, okay, you're saying it like it's a bad thing. And indeed it was, because I went and listened, and he had said that I needed to get my facts straight because I had messed up the performance. I had misreported total returns performance, which what else is there to get right? What are you doing if you can't correctly cite PIMCO total return performance in a story about come on, you're a bond reporter. So it was really, really deeply embarrassing. And then to be name checked by the the bond legend, right, Bill Gross on Bloomberg Radio, it was pretty harrowing. So he continues to talk on the radio. He loves Tom Keene, and he was on the show all the time. And they're chatting about, the Taylor rule or whatever. Meanwhile, I'm at my desk, trying not to vomit, trying to fact check, figure out the correct number to put in. And Bill had said something on air. I'm trying to replicate what he had said, but I keep getting a different number. And I'm like, I must be losing my mind. Bill Gross said this number. I have to figure out, what am I doing wrong? Is it the time horizon? Is it the share class? Am I somehow looking at the wrong share class? And I keep trying different things, and I'm like, I'm just getting this one answer. And it's what's going on? Surely, Bill Gross knows how to use a Bloomberg terminal better than I do, right? I know I've been working at Bloomberg for years, so I could navigate it, but come on, it's Bill Gross. So anyway, at the end of his Bloomberg interview, he had said that he would call me after he hung up from the radio, which yay. And indeed he did. And so I'm like, hey, Bill.
Had you met at this point? Did you know each other?
No.
Oh gosh. So this was literally.
No, I was freaking out. Yeah. And to some extent, it's part of the job. You talk to remarkably important people all the time, on background or whatever. So I was trying to keep it together. But this was particularly humiliating, right? And so he calls me. He's like, hey. I'm like, hey. He's like, I get it. Life happens. I don't remember what exactly he said, but he was really nice about it. He'd already kind of thrown me under the bus. So he had done the punishment part, and now he was nice. And I was like, okay, but while I have you, I need your help. I can't figure out how to get the numbers that you said on air. You said total return performance, and I'm messing something up. What am I doing wrong? And he kind of snickered, and he goes, you got to say your numbers. I got to say mine.
It's a great line. Do you think
what?
It was a great line. Now, so subsequent to that, did you develop a relationship with him? And did he, how did it work with interviewing him for this book?
Yeah, I have to say, he's been very great to me. He comes and goes. He's obviously, sometimes a bit mercurial, as you see in the book. But I think fundamentally, I appreciate the bond market. I like the bond market. I think it's interesting. I can kind of navigate, I know the what the words mean and stuff. And I appreciate the artistry of it. And I think that fundamental connection, obviously Bill also likes the bond market and appreciates the complexity and beauty of it. So I think the fact that we kind of share that to some extent, I think he appreciates that, and it created kind of a foundational like a baseline for us to have a conversation and a relationship. And, I would call him about stories and talk to him about, I heard you're selling strangles. Like we had, and, he would be on Bloomberg TV and I would write up his comments on Bloomberg TV. My job was very oriented around caring about what he was doing and writing it. And sometimes that was more pleasant than others. And I think that, to some extent too, I arrived in the aftermath. Like I started covering PIMCO full time as a beat reporter. I covered other companies, but the action was all PIMCO. So my job was all PIMCO. At a time when kind of the battle lines had already been drawn, if you will. Like a lot of the other reporters had already written their like Bill Gross is actually mean stories, and he felt burned by a lot of journalists.
Okay.
They were doing their job. They did an incredible job, but as a result, he was like, okay, that line is dead. I'm not going to call that person anymore.
Right.
And so I show up basically fresh meat. And I'm like, what's going on, everybody? Like, how are we doing today? And I think that was an easy way, that gave me a bit of an advantage when things hit the fan, because he didn't see me as already kind of burned. I hadn't already, written a negative story about him. Really, I was just kind of gliding along, writing about interest rates and inflation, whatever was the thing of the moment. Certainly not inflation at the time. But so when things, I think his allies too saw me as not a negative person, a person who was going to be mean to him in some way, which, that's tough too, because again, my colleagues at other outlets, my like very amazing peers, did an incredible job. And of course, our job is never to take sides. Like we really don't care. Like it's not, we don't root for people.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a, I kind of hate saying it in that way, but because it's not like they had picked a side, but people perceived it as picking a side. But yeah, that made it easier, I think, for him to feel comfortable talking to me.
So at what point do you decide you're going to write a book about this? So
when Bill Gross quit Fired in September 2014, I had to get the story, and we, all of the beat reporters and folks covering it at the kind of bond market at the time, we all kind of scrambled to find out what happened and published our various, this is what I heard, you have tidbits of information as things like drips and drabs, right? It's all kind of like coming out in kind of pieces. And people were very buttoned up. All of our sources were like, I'm not saying anything about what happened. So we had kind of weird puzzle pieces. And I spent the next 3 months. For some reason, I got the luxury of time and space to some extent, to actually go get the story, which you don't always get.
Right.
But I got to dig in and talk to people for literally 3 months and publish this big story in December 2014. That was the true behind the scenes, the fall of the Bond King, I think was the title. With great credit to actually my colleague at Bloomberg, Kathy Burton, helped me shape it and kind of keep chasing it and keep thinking about it in a kind of, you can let these things die sometimes, and she helped me not. So that story gets published, and immediately it just blows up on the terminal. Everyone's reading it, and people are sending it back to me being like, this is bananas. You have to write the book. And I distinctly remember getting those emails and being like, duh. So at some point I had already decided, and I don't really remember that moment, but it was sometime between September and December 2014 when it was just clear that I had way more material than I could put into that once. That story was so intense, so jam-packed. I think it was 3,000 words, which is so long for me at that point in my career. And I was like, I have another 30,000 easily. So let's see where this goes.
Okay. Actually, I have a question about that. Am I correct? This is your first book?
Yes.
So what was it like moving from writing, 3,000 words and usually Bloomberg is even smaller to writing a full book?
You would be, okay, maybe you wouldn't. I was very surprised at how little the skills overlapped. I mean, I strode into this very confident and left broken. So
No, was that your editor saying you got to fix this, you got to do this, you got to change this?
Oh, what wasn't it? It was the facts not lining up, the Ginny Mae story being just absolutely a bear to report. It was people trying to evade my grasp. It was everyone expecting that the other person would tell me the fundamental stories that needed to be in the book until the very last minute, at which time they would be mad at me for not having already gotten those stories. It was, it just was everything all at once. And it's such a like organizational problem. Like writing a book is an exercise in organization.
Oh.
And I am not your girl. Like I do not, I'm like absolute chaos. And the way that I work is by like a deadline giving me enough anxiety that I'll go do the thing. But you can't do that with the book because there's one big deadline, but the thing is too enormous to move forward in a meaningful way in like a panic session. So among other, there are a billion reasons and ways in which it's just a completely different gig. Also, there's no feedback. Like I'm so accustomed to like Bloomberg. The beauty of being a beat reporter is you do these like kind of bite-sized stories and they end up being building blocks, right? You do like, okay, AT&T credit default swaps. Like maybe that story doesn't matter today in this one instance, but I wrote, a 3-paragraph story and then, okay, AT&T is part of the index. What's going on with the index? Like you can build something,
right?
But in a book, it's one thing and you have to keep the whole thing in your head, which is impossible.
Okay, when you set out to write the book, you probably had some ideas about PIMCO and Bill Gross. What was the biggest surprise when you finished the book? Like, what had changed the most?
Such a hard question. In part because I've edited my memory, I'm sure. Who knows what I thought, what I think I thought. I don't know. I know.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think one thing that's it's just kind of, this is more personal than like it's more about me than anything I found. But I think when I started, I was really idealistic and our culture was different too. 2014, I think I thought I was going to write a book about like a great founder, and our world changed a lot over the intervening 7 years. And the narrative that I expected to write was much more like how I built this rather than what I ended up with, which I'm glad I like where I ended, which is this kind of, he's not a perfect leader. He's not there's a lot to kind of unpack, but I think one of the things that I wanted to do was present him as a human being and not this caricature that I think he so often becomes. And I do think I achieved that, but I think in the beginning it was going to be this like, great man story. And by the end it was, I don't know, just the context.
It's more about just about the human as opposed to the. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And listen, you did achieve that. I thought it was terrific that way. One of the questions I also have is that Audible, I've heard from other authors that reading your own book is they either love it, think it's a terrific experience, or they detest it. Which side do you fall down on there? Because I did listen to you, so I feel like I know you already because I listened to you the whole thing. You did a terrific job.
Thank you.
And now obviously we'll talk a little bit about what you do on a regular basis. So you actually speak for a living, so it's not as strange as some authors. But did you like the experience?
I love a barbell strategy, so I'm going to say that I both loved and hated it full force simultaneously because I do talk for a living and I very much enjoy that element of it. And it's really nice in a book context because I did work really hard to make sure that every word is the word that I meant in the order that I meant it, and because I talk to so many people, there are definitely moments throughout the book that it's not even my voice, right? It's not my writing. I'm conduiting. I'm delivering what a source told me to you. So that ability to control the inflection and transmit emotionally through my voice. I think there's so much more communication that happens vocally. It's just a much more intimate, like we can't account for the amount of information that's transmitted by voice, right? And so I think being able to send all of that out in addition to the exact words was really gratifying because that's more work, right? That's like a lot of kind of information that I wanted you to have that just doesn't go on the page. So that was fun, but at the same time, oh my God, it's so hard.
How long does it take? Like how many takes do you do
great question. It was like 5 days. That can't be right.
Do you have multiple takes of every part, or are there parts that they say we got it and you just do that like that 2 pages?
Yes, both. Yeah, like you get on a roll sometimes and you're reading perfectly and just crushing it, and other times like it's like an oxygen management and blood sugar management question as well, where like you have to be physically able to pull it off. Like if I'm really tired, you hear it. If I'm hungry, you hear it. If I like have been going too long, I get like I lose enough oxygen and start frying. My like vocal fry comes in because that's an oxygen release question. And like all of that, I mean, it's so technical. It's like a sport. I say as a not athletic person, so maybe it's not like a sport, but but basically, yeah, you can do like 3 pages and just breeze through it, and then other days you're like doing a sentence at a time, and it's just not coming out.
Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about yourself. You used to be at Bloomberg, and you've now moved to NPR. So you've gone from like the bastion of business to a public radio. What has that been like?
Oh, I love that. Bloomberg is such an incredible training ground. Like I learned more in the years that I was there just about how the world works and how money flows. Just it was an incredible just like boot camp. And that was, I had a very narrow universe. I covered the credit default swap market for years. And that's like a very small, this was after the crisis. It was really small. And that was educational, and I had enough room to like maneuver around and really source build, really get to know the people in my field and understand what they were talking about, which is so invaluable and very hard to, again, find time to do that. Like in a lot of the jobs that are kind of parceled out for journalists these days, I think it is really hard to have the time to get to the granularity and the full comprehensive understanding. But because I lived and breathed just credit default swaps for so long, it just gave me time to get to know it really well. And then, I moved to distressed debt and corporate bonds. And then I moved to PIMCO and another asset manager coverage of those companies. So moving to NPR, the orientation is entirely different, where your job fundamentally at Bloomberg, they do have this broader reach, this like, mainstream audience on web and with the television show, all of that stuff is, yes, they have this broad public phase, but there is a fundamental user, which is the terminal user. So as especially someone covering the credit default swap market, which doesn't always break through to the mainstream, especially in the aftermath of the crisis, my consumers of what I created were largely practitioners. And
Right.
that was a really interesting feedback where they knew things way better than me and could teach me. And so I loved being able to send things out. I will say, when you read something in print, I found that like the knee-jerk response is like, oh, this is wrong, here's how. Whereas an auditory reception, you're more friendly somehow.
Oh.
I think because it's a more intimate experience and I'm conveying more information emotionally, whatever, there's a lot to it that I don't understand still. But the response, it's much more, it's just a warmer interaction.
Maybe it's just NPR listeners are nicer than Bloomberg users.
That could be the case also.
I have a question about NPR. Tiny Desk concerts. You get to go to them?
So if you're in DC, yes, but I've been in New York and then remote in Virginia. So no, I've seen the desk. It looks the way it looks. It's beautiful. It's overwhelming. It's thrilling. It's electric. It was empty.
Oh, I figured that's like probably the biggest perk of working there.
Yeah.
Like
yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Do they tell you ahead of time? Like, is there a schedule and they allow people to come?
Yeah, and it's gotten more fraught, with the pandemic, where I think there's like an elaborate sign up, like maybe a lottery system. I haven't investigated because I'm just not there, so it's kind of my FOMO. I have to just shut it off and put
watch
it away,
it like the rest of us.
I know. Well, I mean the Usher one though. Come on, that was. I like needed popcorn. It was so good. Did you watch that one?
No, I'm not an Usher fan. I'm sorry.
You've got it. It's so good. It transcends.
It transcends. Okay.
Yeah.
Listen, Mary. Oh, I have one more question for you.
Okay.
Because I was going through your bio. I noticed that you were a Watson Fellow.
Yes.
So what is a Watson Fellow?
So the Watson Foundation was created when Thomas J. Watson of IBM retired and, had leftover money and wanted to start this thing that basically allows people graduating from liberal arts institutions, a consortium of them, to pursue their passion, whatever that may be. And you're basically chosen based on your project proposal. And they wanted to not be like accretive to your career. It's supposed to be something kind of off the wall or like some passion, true passion, not a discipline that's going to be part of your capitalism, whatever.
Right.
Job, I guess is what I mean. But, my year I painted portraits. My project was kind of studying the ways in which people's faces and kind of the structure of their faces changes based on where you are in the world. And I loved it. It was incredible. But my year, there was a guy who studied ants. There's like a lot of ant diversity. A guy the year ahead of me studied cattle herding patterns around the world.
Now that sounds interesting.
I know. I mean, the fun of it is finding out what other people's secret passions are. Like, you've been thinking about ants this whole time, like, what's that like? And then you like listening to them, you get hype about ants.
And the important thing is that he realized it right away, and he didn't have to tell his wife at 65.
Right.
I know
ants.
we've been I've spent my whole life just thinking about ants, and it's time for me to go study it.
Exactly. And that there was enough to do that he could go around the world. And I mean, he showed videos of ants carrying just enormous things. It's amazing. I now share this passion.
Okay, Mary, it's been a real pleasure having you on. Why don't you tell people a little bit about your NPR, what you do there, and then also where they can find the book?
Of course, yeah. So I'm a co-host at Planet Money, which is NPR's economics podcast. We like to tell, fun narrative yarns that also teach you something at the end, some greater lesson about the way the world works. And I'm on Twitter at MDC, and I have a Substack that I almost sometimes publish. Oops. Yeah, and I'm on LinkedIn and whatever.
And why don't you give us the name of the book? The most important thing, your editor, your whatever, whoever gets mad at you. I don't know who gets mad at you for not promoting it properly, but someone's going to get mad at you if you don't give us the name.
The Bond King: How One Man Made a Market, Built an Empire, and Lost It All.
Mary, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. This was so fun.
Take care. Thanks for tuning into the Market Huddle. We appreciate you spending some time with us. Patrick, where can they find you?
You can find me at bigpicturetrading.com or on Twitter at Patrick Seresna. Kev, where can they find you?
I'm on Twitter at Kevin Muir, or you can check out my newsletter at themacrotourist.com. And listen, we can never have too many friends. Bear market, bull market. We're just happy to spend some time together on this crazy ride. There'll be no after show. We're going to take next week off. Just as a reminder, no Labor Day show. And we'll be back on in the new kind of the next quarter. So enjoy your summer, and thanks for tuning in.
Happy Labor Day, everyone.